Okay, so now our job is to go ahead and make this form functional so that whenever we click on the submit button, the post request is handled. And once the post request is handled, we essentially want to go ahead and simply log in the user in our Django app. So for that very reason, we have to handle the post request. So as I earlier mentioned, by default, we handle the get request whenever we create a view. So that means whenever we get a get request, this is the logic which is going to be executed. However, when the form is submitted, we should be able to handle the post request. So here I would say if request.method is equal to post. So here I would say post, then do this. And mind that whenever we say request.method, we are actually getting that particular method from the request object. So essentially when you click the submit button, as this particular form, so let me show you the form. So as this form actually submits a post request, when we submit that, technically this request object which we get now is going to contain the method as post. So we simply get access to the request object and then access the method of it, and then we know that the method is post, and then we are going to do the following things. So once the request method is post, we are going to do a certain things, else we are simply going to create this particular form right here. So here I will put this particular block of code in else. And right now we are having an error here because we have not written any code inside the if block. So now let's write the logic of what happens when we submit the form. So when we submit the form, we essentially want to take the data, which is the username and password, and we simply have to log in the user using this particular credentials. So here, in order to get the form data, first of all, you need to get access to the form. So here I would get access to the login form. And now in order to get the data which is posted, we could get that data from the request object which we have. So just as we gotten the access to request.method, we could get access to the data as well. So here I would say request.post, and this is actually going to give us access to all the form data which we have. So here I would say form equals this, and now we are getting an entire form which is filled up with the request data which has been posted. So once we have that particular data, we could check the validity of that particular data using an inbuilt method which is valid. So here we say if form.is_valid. So if this thing is valid, only then we could go ahead and use that data to log in the user. So here I would say if the form data is valid, then do the following things. So first of all, when the form data is valid, we want to pass that form data to a method which is called as authenticate. And what the authenticate method does is that it accepts the request object which we have, it accepts the username and password as well, and checks if that particular password is present in the database. So you don't have to manually create the database and query that database. It's automatically done by Django using the ORM. And what that does is that the authenticate method checks for the username and password in the database, and if it actually finds the user is present, then it returns a user object, and then we save that particular user object in a user variable. So let's go ahead and do that, and it will start making more sense. So first of all, you need to import the authenticate method. So the authenticate method is actually present in the Django contrib auth. So I would say from django.contrib.auth, import the method which is authenticate. And now here I simply have to call that authenticate method. So here I will say authenticate, and this authenticate method, as you can see, takes a bunch of parameters. So first parameter it takes is the request. So let's pass in the request object, give a comma. The second parameter which we need to pass in here is we have to pass in the username and password. But instead of directly passing in the username and password, we first have to clean that particular data because we don't want anything fishy going on in there. So here, in order to clean up that data, I would take the data from the form. So here I would say form, and then say cleaned data. That's actually going to clean up the data for us, and let's save the data into a variable called as data. And now in order to actually pass in the username here, I would say username equals, and then in order to get access to the username which is saved in this data, I would say data of username, And same is the case with password as well. I would say password equals, that's going to be data of password. So this is going to give me access to the cleaned username and password data, and that's going to be passed to this particular authenticate method. And now, as I earlier mentioned, this authenticate method, it's actually going to go through your database, check if the username is present with that username and password. If it finds out that the user is actually present, it's going to return a user object. So as this returns a user object, that user object has to be stored somewhere. So let's type in user equals this, and now the user object is actually stored. And once the user object is stored, we could finally go ahead and do something with it. So if the user object is found, that means the login credentials are valid. And if the login credentials are valid, we simply want to log in that particular user. It's as simple as that. So if the user exists, that means if the user is not none. So we say if the user is not none, which means that if this user object is not empty, in that particular case, we want to log in the user. So in order to log in the user, we have a method which is called as login. So I have to import this method from the same package from where we have imported authenticate. And now once we have imported that, I simply have to say, I want to log in the user, and this login method actually takes in the request object. So I have to pass in request, and along with it, I have to type in the user object as well, because we want to log in that specific user. Therefore, the user object is obviously needed. So once this thing is done, we are pretty much good to go. And if the user is logged in, we want to return some sort of a response, which is, let's say, HTTP response. So we return an HTTP response, and here it's actually importing HTTP response from a different package. So we don't want that. Instead, we want to import it from Django.http. So from Django.http import HTTP response. And here let's use that instead. So HTTP response, and we want to say something like user authenticated and logged in. Or else if this is false, which means that if the user does not exist, that means that our authenticate method is not able to find any user with these credentials, which means that we want to say something like, let's say, invalid login. So here I would go ahead and say return HTTP response, which would say something like invalid credentials or invalid login. Okay, so once we are done with this, we are pretty much good to go. Hopefully everything is correct and this should work. Now the problem here is that we have no way to actually test this particular login method, and that's because we do not have any user registered already in our site, and therefore we are actually going to create a super user for that. But even before creating super user, first of all, make sure that you have used proper indentations over here, or else you're going to have an error when you execute this particular view. Okay, so now in the next lecture, let's go ahead and let's create a super user so that we could test this particular login functionality. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.